Welcome, everybody, to episode number 5 of the Sparks podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Nick Ross, and today's guest is considered to be a master at what they do. Cathy Kavassalis is a master gardener and the founder of the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation. She's also an active member of the Halton Region Group of Master Gardeners of Ontario and helps to moderate the Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook group, which is a really amazing resource for both amateur and professional gardeners alike. She has taught and worked with not-for-profit organizations promoting biodiversity and now volunteers her time as an educator and an inspirational speaker. Her passion definitely comes through in this conversation as we discuss native and invasive plant species and their impact on our pollinators and biodiversity in our environment. I was left feeling very inspired by what she shared, and she was also kind enough to share a long list of resources that are related to today's topic. So if you are interested, be sure to check out the show notes for a link to that information. A big thank you to Cathy for joining me in this conversation today, as well as a big thank you to anyone who's been watching, listening, and supporting the podcast. It's greatly appreciated. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify. So be sure to check that out. And I thank you once again for watching and listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you agreeing to speak with me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Nick.
All right, so I'm really excited about our topic today because I've gotten more into gardening over the years, and I actually came across your work from the Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook page. And I noticed that a lot of people were asking questions, and you were one of the most active responders. And you always had these lengthy, really well thought out responses.
Yes, unfortunately, work has taken me in other areas, and I haven't been able to be as active on the McGoy or Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook forum. But it has been a great opportunity to share information and try and steer social media away from sort of the quick answer to answers that are supported by science and research. And I think that's what that particular Facebook site really tries to underpin the answers, at least by the moderators, with real research, so that it strengthens people's understanding, because there's an awful lot of anecdotal things out there in the gardening community, and some of them are just wrong.
Right.
You need to build a reference library so people can learn, and our knowledge keeps changing, because what I understood 20 years ago is no longer current. And so it's that need to understand that, knowledge grows.
Definitely, yeah. What an appropriate pun. So I guess what I'm kind of hoping to start with, maybe a little bit of an introduction. I know you were a former chemist and a teacher.
Yes, I started off really far away from gardening in physical chemistry. I did my undergraduate work in Mount Holyoke, and then went on to MIT and did research on characterizing the surface of semiconductors. So very far from what I'm doing today. When I came to Canada, I did a degree in education and then a master's in environmental education. And that's really what initially connected me to the serious gardening community. And it was really surreptitious. I was writing articles on biodiversity for a local newsletter for an environmental group, and someone from the local horticultural society asked if I would contribute to their newsletter, and I said sure, but let me go and visit the group and see whether this is a good fit. My first night there, really warm welcome, and this woman, Mary Decker, she's just effervescent, said, "Listen, it happens to be we're electing a board tonight. Would you mind filling a spot? We have a vacancy. We really need to have so many seats." And she sort of explained it all. It all seemed kind of rational to me. And I thought, all right, I'll do that. Anyway, long story short, within 2 months, I end up being president of the Horticultural Society.
Wow.
With very little knowledge of what a horticultural society was, and even not that much knowledge about gardening. And so this really launched me into what it is I do today. And over time, my understanding has significantly changed from that, more than 2 decades ago, when I first became interested in gardening. But right from the beginning, I realized that gardening serves and has served historically an essential role in people's lives. In Ontario, the horticultural societies, it's a sort of a hoity-toity word, but it's actually embedded in our law. That is, there are grants to keep these societies going over time, because in the 1800s, the home gardener was seen as played a critical role because you raised food for your family. And so they basically gave out these grants to these groups to keep them going. And you had to meet these requirements, to have flower shows, and that sort of thing. But the whole point behind it was to improve the culture of plants and particularly food growing. And then also beautification. That was, part of that colonial thing where gardens needed to be pretty.
Right.
That is embedded in sort of Ontario's history and in these horticultural societies. But they also wrote into that law very early on that they were to support the environment. So it was something that I felt that I had some synergies with, that I could get behind and support. But it was fascinating to me that, I have a very complex background. I was born in Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia, was then in the United States, and then coming to Canada. There's been sort of cultural changes in my life. So understanding, the culture of Canada, the culture of Ontario, and this connection to gardening was really, really amazing to me.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you kind of, the way that you came into it wasn't intentionally with that in mind.
No, not at all. And, from as I learned more, then I joined the Master Gardeners. I took courses in horticulture at the University of Guelph. Everything I do kind of intensely. That's
right. That seems to be
the kind
like
of person I am. I get quite obsessive about things. And so, yes, as the journey progresses, I learn more and more. And I find joy in sharing what I learn with other people, because honestly, plants are overlooked. We take them for granted in our lives, right? They're the backdrop, but they also support life. And I think this has been, for me, even in more recent years, kind of profound, is that I really have not recognized the significance of plants to our existence. And again, the reason I agreed to talk with you is that I really want to get across the point that we are caretakers of the land, and our gardens, yes, they support pretty plants and all that sort of thing, but more importantly, they support the life-going structures all around us. And it's really a responsibility of gardeners to realize that what we put in our backyards, in our front yards, on our balconies, impacts life in the big circle of life.
Definitely.
And that is, that has been for me something that I didn't come to right away. And I made a lot of mistakes. 20, 30 years ago, I was very interested in biodiversity. I thought the variety of life on planet was important. But what I didn't understand was the importance of local diversity.
Right.
So when I first created my garden, and I sat on the board of directors of the Royal Botanical Garden, like I was really big into, gardening and bringing plants from all over the world. I had 500 species in my backyard,
wow.
like this little botanical garden. And I thought, wow, this is cool. And if I could find, the species from all over the world, I put them in my garden. But I suppose around maybe 15 years ago, I started seeing my own impact in my own community. I had brought in a plant called butterbur, pesticides japonicus. Really a cool plant. They see amazing leaves, like a foot tall. And I created a bog so I could grow it in my backyard. I thought, isn't this cool? I brought in a plant called Iris pseudochorus. Again, this was before it became popular in the nursery trades, because I was reading all the catalogs to see what's new, what's cool. All of a sudden, I started seeing that pesticides pop up in my neighbor's yard. I started seeing that Iris pseudochorus, which I thought was a wetland species, growing in my sandy soil.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, oh gosh, what's happening here? I didn't put that together for maybe 10 years. Like I cleaned up the bits and pieces. But what I didn't see was the impacts that changing your local flora was having on transforming what was around us. And even though, I live in Oakville, well, now I'm up in Seguin, but, in a city environment, you see the impacts on your neighbor's lawn. I wasn't seeing the impacts in the natural areas that were nearby. And that's come to me within the last 5 or so years. I think the work by folks like Doug Tallamy, for instance, where we're starting to recognize that these plants that we're introducing, this transformation that we're doing, even though biodiversity increased in my backyard, I was leading to a global decrease in biodiversity.
Right, okay.
Because gardeners are selecting a few plants because they're pretty, because they're cool.
Guilty.
Yeah. And not realizing that we're actually now creating this sort of funnel. We're choosing a select few of plants like roses. There's a rose garden everywhere around the world. There's a peony garden everywhere around the world. So these, really pretty, very dramatic plants are now displacing the things that we don't pay attention to, the colic root. You walk out into the woodlands, most people can hardly tell a maple leaf from an oak leaf, let alone all of the interesting, diverse species that are around us. They disregard them. They can disappear from our existence without us even caring, without us knowing them. The only thing is that as we pull all those little threads, as we make them disappear, what they support is also disappearing. And that's what I didn't understand. It was understanding that, I think the number, and I may get this wrong, I think it's about 70% of insects are herbivores. Of those herbivores, about 90% of them require native flora or groups of plants that support their life, just like the monarch is supported by milkweed.
Right.
So as you pull away the milkweeds, as you pull away the critical native flora that support these specialists, they disappear. And again, the public, they know, the glamorous monarchs, but the whole rest of the stuff, they don't see, nobody goes out and looks. They can't tell one bee from another. And so as they disappear, people don't notice. So, one of the things that I often hear, we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, invasive plants, because they displace things more rapidly than others. But they'll say to me like, oh, this periwinkle is covered with bees. I'll say, look carefully at that bee. Send me a picture. Sure enough, it'll be a European honeybee. And I'll have to say to them, well, that's a farmed bee. It's a domesticated bee. It doesn't exist here.
Right.
That bee is displacing other bees. Do you see any of the 400 native species to, the GTA? In Greater Toronto area, and about Southern Ontario, there were about 400 or were 400 native species.
Right, okay.
Again, populations are dwindling.
Mm-hmm.
Look how little land there is. People think there's enough land in the forest, there's enough natural land to support these populations. No, we have agricultural lands, we have, cities, we've urbanized things, we've built a network of highways, but there isn't enough places to support the native flora necessary to support the native species. It's all part of that food web, right? That dynamic of life. And we're just dwindling it down and not realizing what's happening around us. Again, because green looks green. A Norway maple looks to most like a sugar maple.
Right.
The distinction of what they support is not understood.
Right, right. No, that was so well said. And I love the idea of reconnecting to the environment through gardening and through becoming aware of these, like realizing the importance and that responsibility of how you can become a part of this ecosystem and support it.
Right. Yeah. It's recognizing that we're part of life.
Right.
We part of the cultural and historical heritage of humanity is that, and particularly for colonizers like myself, is that we had this urge to kind of remake and reform the world around us so that it just suited our needs, right? And honestly, people thought they were doing the right thing, bringing plants from all around the globe. Food, of course, we moved with us, but we also moved pretty things. Now, some of those food plants have become serious invasive plants. Wild parsnip, for instance, is now a serious problem in Ontario. It's escaped cultivation. Queen Anne's lace, which most people think is native because it's so abundant. Well, that's wild carrot, right? Same species, different genetics. And so it's these little transformations that as we're changing the plants we bring, we're changing the world around us.
Right.
Changing what can survive in the world around us. And the real fear, and the UN has written some very lengthy, well-researched reports, is that the fabric of life is diminishing at an incredible rate. The extinction rate of species now is well above sort of the natural rate at which things blink in and out of existence.
Right.
And so, some people use the term, apocalypse, and, there are those that are, the world is ending kind of thing. I am sort of in the middle. The world isn't ending. There are winners and losers in how we're choosing plants, and lots in between. So, as we roll out the lawns all over our gardens, well, who wins? Well, earthworms. Again, earthworms are invasive species. They were introduced to Canada. They are not native to Canada. So, but they like turf, as do all those little Japanese beetle larvae.
Oh, the Japanese beetles.
So again, we've transformed things. We're now supporting Japanese beetles, again, obviously from the name, not from Canada.
Right.
And then what survives? Well, there are some native species like robins do really, really well. Canada geese do really, really well. So there are these big winners in these transformations. And then there are the losers, the things that are going to disappear. And oftentimes there are things that are already not particularly common. But, there are things, for instance, trying to think of something your viewers would know. Won't come to mind. But think of, in the forest, you'll often see this thing called a dogtooth violet. It's a little spring ephemeral with a little yellow plant, very, very pretty. It has a little bee that will only feed on that plant.
Oh, really?
So as dogtooth violet disappears, the bees that require it will disappear. Nobody much will notice. There are so many of these unique relationships that people don't know are going on around them because we don't take the time to look what's happening in our garden at the sort of the micro level. Life will go on. The rats, the cockroaches, they're going to persist long after everything disappears. There are going to be things that survive. So life is going to continue, but it's going to continue in a very different way.
Right.
And I think we have a moral responsibility to ask ourselves, do we have the right to lead to the demise of so many species around us? Now, my answer is no, we don't. And so, my work in what's left of my senior years is to try and help educate people about the serious beauty of life that is native to our region, how fascinating it is, all the interesting relationships that once we put ourselves sort of in that midst and start learning about it, that we can get inspired and want to support it, so that we see ourselves as caretakers of the land rather than transformers of the land. and think it's a very different way of understanding ourselves and our place in the universe. So, I have no, I'm on social media enough. I get enough feedback and negative comments that I realize a lot of what I'm saying pushes back at a lot of core passions. I was a member of that horticultural society. I did share peonies, and the bigger the better.
Right.
I was part of that community and still am. I mean, I still have my peonies. I still have some of those things. But over time, I'm taking them out of my garden and replacing them with Keystone species.
Right, right.
I'd like to talk a little bit about those if we can.
Yeah, definitely.
Because, again, Dr. Doug Tallamy, and if your viewers haven't listened to him or read any of his work, he's got some great YouTube videos that are easy to go out and watch. But his research and his background was in entomology. So again, the understanding of insects. And he was looking at the rate of insects disappearing around the world. And studies now are putting it at about 9% per decade of terrestrial.
Wow,
so it's
9% per decade.
It's significant. So why is that happening? And again, he's one of the research scientists who's put it together with the plant world. And they've done some really cool studies looking at things like chickadees. So a chickadee to raise, 4 little eggs, a cluster of eggs in spring, has to collect between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars over the course of 16 days. Think about that.
Wow. Can you just, let's just pause there for a second.
Yeah, just pause there and imagine that.
So you said 4 eggs.
Yeah, 4 eggs. That's about 500 caterpillars a day.
Wow. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in 16 days to raise, what did you call it, a clutch?
A clutch, a brood, whatever. I'm not sure the technical word for it.
Wow. That's crazy.
But what's more important is what they discovered was the caterpillars or the insects that they are using need to be mostly native.
Right. Okay.
And it was the research not by Doug Tallamy in itself, but in his research group. I think her name is Desiree Narenga. And what she discovered, what you had to have was 70% native biomass in order for them to be able to sustain their population.
Right. Okay.
Think about that. 7 out of 10 leaves. Biomass is not necessarily plants, but it's sort of the big picture massive thing. Needs to be from a native plant. So
would that also apply to like a way of thinking about our own garden would be roughly 70% native plants you want?
It's a target, right? We don't know, right? This is research on one species, and again, people can knock things down because you don't want to overstate the problem. But this is one research. So I use that when I'm giving talks as a goal. Aim for 70%, right?
Yeah.
Because we have this data point and we can see this decline, and we have some other statistics. So we know that native plants are critically important to holding things together.
Yeah.
So I think that's just amazing. And again, his work has been really transformative for me. And it's this new research that's really looking at how things are connected that has changed my approach dramatically.
Right.
And I think it's exciting. Like it has empowered us to know, well, how can you make a difference? And so the next step in that research was saying, well, are all species created equal in what they support? Can I plant, what's the difference between an introduced ginkgo biloba, which is really pretty cool, I've got one, and, one of these sugar maples or an oak? Well, it turns out there's an enormous difference. Whereas a ginkgo biloba can support one species of caterpillar, an oak can support more than 500 different species over 500. That northeastern temperate region. So in Ontario, it's probably not 500, it may be 300, 400, but still it's a significant number.
Yeah, that's huge.
So what they did was they looked, and they are still looking because this is research, there's not a lot of dollars that go into this kind of research. So it's understudied. Bugs in general, unless we can eat it or profit from them.
Right.
Very little money goes into this kind of academic research. But what they've found was that there are certain trees, the Keystone species, that support a huge number of native lepidoptera caterpillars of moths and butterflies. And so oaks were number one. I can't remember quite the order. It's oaks, cherries, birch, maple. I'll get it wrong. Pine is somewhere. Or anyway, you can find online the National Wildlife Federation in the United States has put these on graphs so that people can pull up that information. And then they've looked at, so those are the keystone species for moths and butterflies. Mm-hmm. There are then keystone species for bees. And as I mentioned, we've got 400 native bees.
Right.
And there are plants like goldenrod, like our asters, the Symphoeotrichum, that support huge numbers comparatively of plants. So if you don't have a lot of space in your garden and you don't want to do a whole, replanting, you can each year add little swaths of these keystones and make a difference. Because particularly in our urban centers, we're like a little tapestry. And if we can become sort of interconnected, make corridors and pathways, we become lifelines for these things. Now, it doesn't, one goldenrod in one yard isn't going to do much.
Right.
It should be, and anytime you plant species, they need a certain number, a certain biomass in order to be useful. So, look at planting something in a square meter, for instance.
Right. Okay.
And then, I can't, bees are so cool. So cool. And if people want to do more learning, the Ohio State University offers these free courses. And for nerds like me, they are just so much to gobble up. And you can learn, just how many pieces of pollen that these bees have to collect in order to raise their broods, right? And, most of our bees are solitary bees. That is, they aren't like the European social bees that have hives and nests.
Oh, really? Okay.
They're either cavity builders, that is, they'll make a little hole in the stem of a plant, or they'll make a hole in the ground. And
I didn't know
one
that.
egg in there. So, these bees have to work really hard to, put food in each of these little spaces to support and raise populations. But bees are fascinating. Again, most people don't understand them. They fear them. Most of the solitary bees are absolutely harmless. They will not. They don't sting you. Some of them can't sting.
Right.
And some of them you literally have to sort of step on them before they're going to bite.
Right.
But anything would do that, right? Anything you're trying to kill is going to try and defend itself. But we can make these changes. And if you get out there and start looking in the garden, you can start to see, there are these beautiful little metallic green bees that you'll see, particularly in the GTA. Oh, bunch of different species, but these little sweat bees and stuff, and they'll start coming to your garden. And as you change the plants in your garden, you'll see changes in the population of things that it can support.
Right.
And we need to find joy in that diversity, not just the big flowers that are showy that we can say, look at this rose, but to say, wow, look at these notches in these rose leaves. That's a leaf cutter bee. And it's going to take those beautiful circular little patches and it's going to put them in a cavity and it's going to put its little baby inside there in a little cradle. To me, that's remarkable. It's, that you think about how life evolved in these really unique and complex ways. In the windowsill, every spring, I'm washing windows, open my windows. I'll see along the window ledge all of these little grass tubes. And I discovered it's this little wasp that makes these little nests all along my windowsill, and it hunts the cicadas up in the trees. Like, it's really specialized.
Wow.
And again, it's just And so, I try real hard not to damage them.
Yeah.
Just to leave them. But it's accepting that that's, as long as they're not intruding on my life or doing harm, that I can live beside them and marvel at them and realize they're part of this, a web that's outside of my existence. Like, I don't see what they're hunting. It's high in the canopies. I will never see them doing anything except this little brood on the ledge. So there's so many things like that. And honestly, there was a young girl, she's now an adult, lived up the street from me, and kids in my neighborhood come to my yard. It's kind of a cool place. I've got ponds and things like that. Anyway, her mom called me one day and said, "Listen, my daughter's in tears. She was in high school at the time, and she was learning about the environmental crisis, and she was feeling hopeless." And I said, "Send her over, and we'll have a talk." And we sat in the backyard, by the pond, and I scooped up a handful of soil, and I said, "In my hands, there are more than 1 million bacteria. There are hundreds of thousands of nematodes, of microorganisms. This is life. This life continues well beyond us. And while you may not be able to change what's happening on a global level, you can care for the life that's in your sphere." And it's recognizing that all around us is incredible diversity of organisms that we can relate to in a different way, and take joy in that complexity, and know that we're not going to make all the right decisions in what lives and dies, but we can try to be more respectful that other things would like to survive, and we can try to encourage and support that life, because frankly, our lives do in the end depend on biodiversity around us. All those bees, those pollinators, that gives us food. And yes, we can farm honeybees, but if anybody reads the news, they know honeybees are in trouble because, again, we put all our eggs in one basket.
Right.
We need to support our native bees. As biodiversity is declining, fisheries are declining, bird populations are declining. Those things which we actually depend upon are disappearing at a rapid rate. And again, if we don't pay attention, life is going to get seriously difficult. And already with climate change, we've got stuff happening that simultaneously we have to be aware that biodiversity loss is occurring. And it is critical that we do something about both.
Right.
Climate change is a mitigating factor for biodiversity loss. So they are concurrent, and one is actually, they're both contributing to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So as we transform our environments and our landscapes, we contribute to climate change. We know that trees are part of the solution for climate change because, again, they use the carbon dioxide and create oxygen, but they are not a sole solution. Right. So it's understanding, again, that our world is all interconnected, and we are part of that process.
Yeah, it's so inspiring to hear you talk, because it definitely, like, the passion comes out, right? I can just feel how passionate and excited and joyful you are about talking about this kind of stuff. And I can just imagine someone being like, "Oh no, I have so many non-native plants in my garden. Where do I start?" Right? So they want to start supporting this and to start helping. So maybe we could describe a little bit of the difference between, like, the native, the exotic, and the invasive. Maybe we can kind of start there.
Let's do that. Okay, so native species, again, there is no agreed upon scientific definition, because what is native changes over time.
Right. Okay.
Could I pull up a slide?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, feel free to share your screen. I think some people are just going to be listening to it, so we'll just do our best to describe it. But yeah, feel free.
To grow. Yeah. Okay. So you have to enable sharing.
Okay. Let's see. How do I do that? Did you request, or is it?
I did, and it said host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh,
That's
okay.
okay. I can talk through it.
Sure.
All right.
While you do that, I'll see if I can.
Sometimes for some visual learners, pictures can help.
Yeah, definitely.
But yes, around the globe, people may be aware of something they learned in high school called biomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where each place, the deserts, the Arctic, there's a different, you'll see different plants and you'll see different animals. So if you went to Australia in a temperate forest there, you're going to see eucalyptus trees.
Mm-hmm.
And in those eucalyptus trees, you're going to see koalas, right?
Right, okay, yeah.
So over time, plants in biogeography have sort of migrated to different places, and over millions of years, relationships have developed.
Mm.
So you won't see a eucalyptus native to Canada because it didn't evolve here. It didn't establish here very early on. So native has to do with time and space and relationships.
Okay. So
in Ontario, the whole of this land was covered in a glacier 10,000 years ago.
Right.
Everything in Ontario migrated here, most of it from the temperate forests of the United States. So there was no native plants at all until around 10,000 years ago.
Right.
So as plants moved into the region and started having relationships with the land, with the climate, and with the organisms that began to establish, those are what we call native. Over time, what's native changes, but it changes not on a decade or century level. It changes on a millennial or millions of years of time. So over time, what we call native is going to be different. But again, it's that relationships, those bees and those native flora, most of them cannot change overnight what they evolve to eat.
Right.
Generationally, they can. That is, the one generation may not survive, but again, as evolution goes, selection will select for those that can eat a novel food or take pollen from a novel plant. Pollen is food, by the way.
Right.
So, again, that's a very complex explanation. So, I want people to understand that it is fluid.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that when you bring a plant in from, for instance, Asia or Australia, something that perhaps in terms of ecological time evolved maybe 10 million years ago, and you plop it into a new environment, it has very different chemicals in its foliage, and they may not be edible by anything here. And in fact, that's often why gardeners choose plants, because it doesn't get holes in the leaves.
Right.
And they'll notice that right away. They'll say, it's perfect. That boxwood you put in the garden, nothing eats it. That periwinkle, the leaves just look perfect. It's like a little plastic plant, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's introduced, exotic, non-native. Again, they have no relationships with anything here. So that's part of that distinction. And then, of course, there are plants we call invasive.
Right.
These are non-native species that are disruptive and do harm. And they do harm, and this is defined by our federal government. So they do harm to the economy, to the environment, or to public health.
Right, okay, yep.
So a good example of an invasive species that people will see all around them is something like purple loosestrife, right? Mm-hmm. Purple loosestrife was introduced as an ornamental plant, escaped cultivation, and then over the decades, it moved into wetlands, displaced wetland species, and we started seeing declines in the wetland health.
Right, okay.
So, and that's in general, invasive species tend to do that. They form these large monocultures. They don't allow native plants to grow, and they disrupt the food webs and the ecosystem function around them. Phragmites is another great example of a plant that people will see all up and down the corridors across Ontario. And again, it forms these vast fields where nothing else can grow. And also, by definition, invasive plants are difficult to remove. If they were easy to remove, we wouldn't worry about them.
Yeah, they wouldn't be as much of a problem.
Right. Now, Phragmites is fascinating. And I'm taking you down a different path.
Oh, yeah, feel free.
Phragmites australis is sort of the species name, the scientific species name. We have a native Phragmites australis, and it's a subspecies, Americanus. It occurs across America. It is not invasive. Right. It exists in ponds. You can go to Y Marsh, and there's a little field of Phragmites, but we've introduced new genetics. And it was just a subtle change in genetics that came, most of it, they believe it's from a European strain, got introduced here, and all of a sudden that plant had a competitive advantage. That little chemical shifts that occurred in the plant made it able to displace native species, made it less palatable to native herbivores. And of course, then you see this explosion occur over time. So it's these sometimes very subtle little changes that we often introduce through gardening that have impacts. So I'll go back to the story of purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife, again, was probably introduced by settlers in the 1800s. We have documented about 1814. We didn't see it being a real problem until about 1930. What was happening in the meantime? Well, gardeners like to breed. They breed plants so that they have prettier flowers. So, they make more flowers, that they're hardier, they're more robust. And it was part of that we spliced in some native loosestrife genes. We spliced in some genes from Lythrum virgatum. So Lythrum salicari is the invasive species, but we've created these hybrids. And the research by a fellow by the name of Lindgren in the prairie provinces showed that it was these cultivated plants that actually spurred this thing on, because it's those subtle changes in genetics that made these plants, again, less palatable and more successful. So as gardeners and as plant breeders and that sort of thing, we need to recognize that the choices of plants that produce more seeds, more flowers, that are more vigorous and hardier, we can often be creating problems for future generations.
Right. And the timeline on that. So you said it was 1814 when it was introduced?
Right.
And then it wasn't until 1930 where it started to be noticed?
People began to notice it, yeah. And the timeline of invasion is something that's been really well studied now. And again, a slide could help show this, but it's sort of a 3-phase curve. So if you can imagine, there's a long period of time where the plant is introduced and nobody much notices any growth outside of cultivation. Then all of a sudden you see this steep rise. And about halfway up that curve, people start looking out the window and saying, oh gosh, there's periwinkle in this woodlands in Sault Ste. Marie. There's periwinkle in this forest in Ottawa. And all of a sudden people say, could this be invasive? And by that point, again, it keeps accelerating. And at some point, it kind of curves off. It fills all the niches it can. And sometimes we also introduce things that like to eat it, or something learns to eat it, and you'll see sort of a down curve at the top of that. But it's like this large S-shaped curve with a very steep rise in the middle. But that lag at the beginning can be 50 to 100 years.
Oh, wow.
And there's a number of reasons for that. And I get a little technical here.
Yeah.
There's something called the propagule pressure hypothesis. So what does this mean? It means propagules simply are, how does a plant replicate? So it can replicate by seeds, it can replicate by tubers or fragments of roots, rhizomes, right, that can get spread around. The more you have these little propagules spread around, the more the opportunities for those plants to breed and seed. So it's kind of this slow process as we're sort of, one little plant escapes here, one plant escapes there. You need this number to reach a certain level before it can go boom.
Right, like a tipping point.
That's right. This is tipping point where all of a sudden it can breed, it can produce seed, or what's happening now up here. I'm really concerned with knotweed. As people move along the highway corridors, little fragments of roots and seeds get carried and distributed along the highway corridors, and we all across the province. So it's recognizing this thing called propagule pressure. And of course, part of that is plant sales. So when someone sees yellow flag iris, a beautiful yellow iris, right? And you got a little pond garden, so you put it in your pond garden, and all of a sudden you aren't watching where those seeds are going or where the birds are taking it or the wind is blowing it, and it's getting hooked on clothes and people are hiking in the woods, and all of a sudden it's little bits everywhere, and then boom. And that's what happened with purple loosestrife. That's what happened with Phragmites, right? It's again, these things were introduced a long time ago, but it took quite a while for enough little pieces of it to be distributed before the plant could really take off and then cover these great expanses. And so it's something we need to be really aware of as gardeners, that when we say, oh, it's not a problem in my garden, I don't see it doing anything. And oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many people on social media, whenever you mention a plant that we know is invasive, and they'll say, I don't see it. And no, many people don't see it in their own space because, again, there are a lot of factors. It has to find the right bit of soil, it has to have the right environmental conditions, it has to get carried a distance from them, and people just aren't looking. Really, for the most part, people don't see what's happening around them. And so as we change our gardens, I'd say if you want to make the biggest difference, get rid of invasive plants and introduce keystone plants. So if you don't, you don't want to transform your garden, sure, your rose is likely not doing any harm. Your herbaceous peony is likely not doing any harm. Tree peonies, you need to watch for. But I mean, it's complicated, but people need to now make themselves more aware. Do the research when you're buying a plant, right? To try and understand, is this plant going to do harm? You may say, okay, in my yard, I don't care what I plant, but at least try not to use plants that are going to do harm somewhere else.
Yeah, and they may say, well, like I have it contained. And like you said, so there's multiple ways that it can spread without really realizing it. So you said what, like wind, birds, insects? Winds,
birds, insects, clothing, feet, footwear,
pets.
The people who love nature go hiking in the forest, right? There are many little plants that, the little seeds hook onto your clothes. You don't even notice those things. And it brings them inside woodlands. So there are so many ways, both intentionally and unintentionally. And, I'm up here now in Seguin, Ontario, in sort of cottage country. And so many people from various regions decide they want these easy growing plants up at their cottage.
Right. Like low maintenance.
So what do? They bring in the invasives because they're fast ground covers. When we moved here, I guess a little over 5 years ago, it was blankets of lily of the valley dropping down into the forest woodlands.
Right.
It was, I had knotweed here. I had goutweed, again, vast stretches of goutweed. That bright orange daylily, the ditch lily.
The ditch lilies, yeah.
And a different lily, which is also invasive. People aren't recognizing, but it's a Lilioptera, I think is the name. But anyway, again, this was just like ground central for invasive plants. And, 5 years later, I've made a little impact, at least around the edges, but it will be a lifetime before I'm even close to, I probably never will get invasive plants out of here. I make a priority list to say, what's placing the native lands at greatest risk and working on those first.
Right. So you've been in the process of, like, how do you go about doing that?
Okay, well, again, it's for different plants, the techniques are somewhat different, but you have for invasive plants, generally it's not a single year process.
Right, right.
And because pesticides are not available for most Ontario gardens, there are some, again, if you've got something that's poisonous or a hazard to health, you can use something like Roundup for.
Right.
So, for instance, if you had a stand of knotweed and you couldn't get out of your driveway safely, you can use Roundup or a glyphosate to deal with it.
Do you need to apply for that, or is it available, or?
For if it threatens public health, you don't need a permit.
Oh, okay, okay.
That's simply so. If you go to Home Depot or Canadian Tire, you can see it. Many of these herbicides are available, and again, for some people, it's poison ivy, which is a native plant but still poses a health threat. It may be something like giant hogweed, for instance, poses a health threat. Wild parsnip, a health threat. So for those, you don't need a permit. For others, and in my case, I could apply for a permit because I'm abutting on natural lands. You can go to the Ministry of Natural Resources and say, and ask for a letter, and they can make available to you the proper pesticide. But for the most part, I've been trying to control things without pesticides. And so I'll describe lily of the valley and goutweed first, because I use different techniques for both of those. Goutweed was the easiest because it was in a very large, it was in a garden, but it was in full sun and there were no tree roots or anything around.
Right.
So I literally cut the entire garden to the ground completely. And
now, was that just like mowing or like manually cutting, or what do you mean by cutting?
I used a bushwhacker.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, where it was, the mower wouldn't go. So
you just went around and weed whacked the whole thing.
Weed whacked the whole thing to the ground.
Yeah.
And again, I first took out any plants that I wanted to save from the cluster, washed the roots so that I didn't have any fragments, because any goutweed is going to grow.
Right. And I think that's one of the concerns is when people give away plants or they move plants or move it around their garden, you get little weeds.
Yep. That's how I inherited many of my problems. It's from the horticultural plant sales.
Right. And it comes along with these little pieces.
Yeah. And they didn't see it because it wasn't there, but you just need a fragment. So creeping bellflower, goutweed, all of these, just tiny fragments is all you need. So after I mowed it, I put a tarp over it, a very thick, dark tarp. Well, actually, no, I solarized it, in that area. So, and solarization is slightly different from tarping. Solarization works by creating a tiny little greenhouse, and it only works in full sun, and it only works where there's bare soil.
Right, okay. So
you take a thin, doesn't have to be very thick, of clear, that plastic sheeting they sell at Home Depot, put it down for painting.
Yeah.
Spread it on top. Well, first, you're clear to the ground. Water it well, so it's kind of wet. Then cover it with this plastic sheeting and weigh it down so there's no air gaps around the outside. Essentially, you're creating this little greenhouse. So the sun's going to heat the soil, cooks it. You'll see water underneath forming so you know that it's doing its thing on the plastic sheet. And you just have to leave it in place for at least a growing season. Okay. With most of these things, sometimes you need multiple growing seasons. But for me, the goutweed, I took it out in a season. Now, about midsummer, things started to regrow. I went in and with a hoe and I cut everything back to the ground and then recovered it and repeated. But nice hot summer, lots of sun, that works. For things that are not in the sun, and again, there was another expanse of a whole variety of invasive plants that were in a shadier spot. And again, I cleared it to the ground and I took heavy tarps that didn't allow any light in. So there are some tarps that allow light to go through.
Yeah.
Those won't work. So again, you're not cooking it this time. You're starving the plants of sunlight, which they need because that's how they create the energy to feed their roots.
Right.
For many plants, this doesn't work if they have large storage units underneath. So creeping bellflower, for instance, if it's really well established and it has these dormant roots underneath, or Japanese knotweed, you would have to keep it covered for 3 to 5 years.
Wow. Wow.
You know,
They can survive underneath without that resource.
Yeah. Japanese knotweed, for instance, they have seen it survive up to 20 years.
Wow.
If it's a big enough, root system under there, it just goes dormant until the conditions are right, and then it can come back up. So some of these, again, with Japanese knotweed, you really may have to go to pesticides if it's a serious infestation. But for me, it worked to tarp these things. I had to do it for 2 seasons. And again, it's a long period of time. Yes, tarps are doing damage. They are not without environmental consequences. You are allowing microplastics into your soil. That's doing damage. You are killing microorganisms in the soil. Right. That's doing damage. But you are always weighing the costs.
Yeah, the trade-offs.
The trade-off. Over the long term, I have decided that doing away with the plants is more critical. Mm-hmm. And because, life will move back into those areas, I'm not killing everything off. Again, This is a very large piece of land. So I'm doing it in sections over time.
Right.
And that works. Now, for lily of the valley in the forest, much more difficult. Because, of course, you cannot tarp that area without damaging tree roots, because the trees need to exchange gases. They need to share oxygen.
Right. Okay.
With the atmosphere. So you can impact maybe a third of a tree's roots at any period of time without killing it. More than that, you're going to kill the trees. So what's worse, the invasive plant or killing the trees?
Right.
So what I did was, again, broke it into sections where I hand removed it as much as possible. And there are these wonderful little Japanese hoes and tools that can help you get into the soil. But you're leaving fragments in there. And as long as there's a fragment, it's going to keep coming back.
Right.
So this is a 5-year minimum process.
Wow.
In a particular area, because little pieces are going to reappear. And so I was just talking to a gardener yesterday who said 10 years later, she's seeing it reemerge.
10 years working on that.
Was it the same plant or something reintroduced?
Right.
We don't know. But it's one of those things that once it's there, you have to be vigilant. Mm-hmm. So I hand removed it. At the leading edge of it, I didn't tarp. That is, I didn't introduce plastics. I took I took the leaf bags that are waxed.
Yeah.
They do compost, but again, they don't allow oxygen. They are essentially suffocating. So I used a strip of those. I piled it heavily with leaves and mulch, so really thickly, so that nothing could come up. And I put that all along the leading edge, so it couldn't descend further down into the woods.
Right.
I was careful again to think about the trees that I was impacting, to make sure that the area that I had mapped off wasn't doing significant harm to them. Mm-hmm. And over the course of 2 years, right now, I don't see any in that section that I originally started.
Fingers crossed.
I keep moving, and I come back every year. I walk through the areas with my hose and, pull out any little piece. Plants have to eventually get the light, photosynthesize in order to live. Mm-hmm. So eventually you're going to starve them if you're vigilant. But again, not everybody wants to spend, a weekly walk through the garden cutting off heads. It will work.
Yeah.
Everything has to have light to survive. Some can survive longer without it. So it depends on the size of the spaces you're dealing with. And again, if it's truly extensive, I honestly, I am not an advocate for pesticides. Mm-hmm. But just as we use antibiotics for certain illnesses, I think there is a time and a place where you treat pesticides like antibiotics. You use them responsibly, and you look to see what are the ecological impacts and what's going to do the greater harm over time. In my opinion, invasive plants over time, if they're literally like lily of the valley, going to remove all of the native vegetation. They are not living nicely side by side. They are simply, it was so dense, there was nothing else there.
Yeah, wow.
I was told by previous owners there had been wild orchids there.
Right.
They simply do not exist.
Wow.
There were trillium, again, in that area, no trillium, nothing.
Just took over.
Just next to it, there's the wild lily of the valley, the myanthemum, which is native to here.
Okay.
And there's also Clinton's lily. So it was literally, they were just butting up against each other. So I'm seeding back now.
Right, okay.
From the food bank, the seed bank that's here to try and repopulate it with what was here. I'm not an advocate for returning to, pre-European times, right? To say that we can go back to this kind of pristine view of what nature was.
Right.
We simply can't. We have done so much. I want to say the word damage, but I would say we've transformed nature so much that it is a new novel ecosystem. This land is now full of earthworms. Those earthworms have changed the soil chemistry. They've changed the rate of decomposition of leaves. And it may be that the earthworms are more responsible for the ability of the lily of the valley to descend, and that some of the native species simply won't be able to exist. I don't know. I'm trying to recover. I found a patch of the sort of the native lady slipper, and I'm trying to propagate it. But I know that it's very closely tied to what are called mycorrhizal fungi. These are fungi that live in association with the roots of plants.
Right, okay.
To help them obtain nutrients. One of the problems with earthworms is they break up these fungal networks, and they can actually cause these mycorrhizal communities to disappear. So we may see that orchids can no longer exist in some of these types of forests where we're getting this leaf exchange, because the earthworms, the European earthworms, there's many kinds of earthworms. The European earthworms pull material up and down from the surface. And so they're just changing the structure of soils. So again, over time, we may have to rethink what can grow here, but I'm advocating for slowing that transformation down so that new relationships, hopefully with some of the native species, can continue. And that we don't break things down so rapidly that it causes these cataclysmic collapses of food webs.
Yeah, I think that really highlights just the importance or the devastating impact it can have, and how it seems like bringing in these species, but over time it can really lead to these big problems. And I'm wondering if we could move into maybe talking a bit about like nurseries, and so there's Heman's Garden Center near me. I don't know if you've ever been there in London, Ontario.
Yes, I have.
It's massive, and it's I'm like a kid in a candy store there, right? It's just they have so much. But I did notice their native section is actually quite small. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit. I think you're part of the Council for Invasive Species.
Yes, I am the co-founder of the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Species Regulation. And it's, again, that coalition, CIPR, does not necessarily advocate for just native species, but we do advocate that nurseries don't carry invasive species. So that's sort of different.
Like at the least that they don't
at the very least, that's where they go. So my heart of hearts, I wish they would carry more natives. And, the industry is in a difficult situation. And I want to make very clear that, we need nurseries. We need plant growers, and we need to make sure that they can have a viable income. Unfortunately, most of the plant material that's sold in Canada is non-native, simply because of historical reasons, and they have a lot of invested into propagating these plants. And as long as there's consumer demand, there's going to be growers who provide what they see in their next door neighbor's yard. right?
Right.
And so in Oakville, everybody has hydrangeas, everybody's got daylilies and lawns. Those are the big things. And then, the nurseries try and bring in sort of big and showy things. But why do they have so few natives? Partly is we don't know how to grow natives in some ways. Partly it's because native plants aren't as showy,
right,
as the commercial ones. And again, some advocates are saying, we should create cultivars to make them prettier. And again, as I talked about earlier, small genetic changes may have impacts that we don't understand. But again, I'm not opposed to nativars, but I think we need to think about that. But it's really lack of knowledge.
Right, okay.
When I first started walking up here in sort of central Ontario, I came across plants I've never seen before that are incredibly beautiful. This tiny little Harlequin cordalis. And I thought, wow, why is this not sold? Like it is pink and yellow and adorable. And I was thinking, gosh, this is beautiful. I think some of it's lack of knowledge. I think there are more than 80 species of sedge. That's a kind of grass-like plant in your area.
Mm-hmm.
And you might see 3 in garden centers, if at all. People don't know them. They don't know haven't started propagating them.
Right.
And so it just hasn't come into the industry as a whole. So it's partly we need consumer demand. That is, people like yourself need to go to Hemans and say, I'd really like more native plant selection. Could you focus on keystone species?
Right.
Could you bring in more goldenrods, more asters? Some of them are quite showy. They would be good. Could you bring in some, native bush honeysuckle instead of the invasive honeysuckle? So part of it is our responsibility as consumers to ask for it. Mm-hmm. And we are trying very hard to, I just this week been going back and forth with Landscape Ontario to try and teach people in the industry about this. Mostly it's I think lack of knowledge. They're not purposely trying to do harm.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just, this is the way things have always been done. And, looking around, it's really hard. It's like this enormous Titanic ship, right?
Right.
It's hard to change course.
Yeah, for sure.
Without hitting that iceberg, right?
Right. That's a great metaphor for it. Yeah, like how to turn this entire ship. And I think it starts with the small movements. That's
right. And we are seeing, even, for instance, you mentioned the Mogoy Facebook page, and I'm seeing now on the Horticultural Association's Garden Ontario Facebook forum, we're seeing shifts. Mm-hmm. We're seeing more people ask the questions, ask, why things aren't being regulated, mm-hmm. and asking what they should be planting instead.
Right.
So, for educators like myself, it's trying to give them lists of things to empower people to make positive changes, mm-hmm. and to try not to overwhelm the industry by saying, yes, you can be profitable and be responsible. Right. You can market yourself as a green solution, rather
that's a great idea.
Be part of, I think the Washington Post about a month ago had our gardens killing the earth as their headline, right?
Wow, right.
And honestly, horticulture has always looked at itself as this green industry, right? Where we sell the plants that provide the oxygen for the world. Well, in some ways, they're sucking the oxygen out of the world because of the choices that we've made, just because of the sort of the colonial heritage and our feeling that, plants don't, it doesn't matter what plant you plant as long as you're planting a plant. Right. And that's where it's changed, right?
And biodiversity. We want a bunch of different plants. And like you said, you were kind of like in this collection phase, and then realizing, actually there's other things, other factors that come into this. And you said, I think it's education and knowledge, which I think you're it seems to be effective in what you're sharing, because like you said, you see more of these questions, more people are becoming aware. I see more of these lawns being turned into the pollinating gardens instead of having a lawn.
Yes, it's slow, and I think people don't necessarily want things to look ragged and wild, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
there's this, and the thing is, it really doesn't have to be. And I've always been interested in garden design. I love art. I think everything we do can be a fusion. And a garden doesn't have to be just weeds.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, some of the proponents for this let your garden be anything are literally cultivating plants that I consider weedy and invasive species.
Right.
So they're allowing the goldenrods and the teasels, and again, non-native introduced species grow because they are seeing pollinators on them.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that, are you really seeing, the diversity of pollinators that is your goal?
Right.
Like, at their heart, they want to do something that supports nature. But in fact, their choices are not necessarily making it better. And so when you want to do these transformations, you want to do the right thing. It doesn't mean that the garden can't have design, can't have structure, can't meet some of our sort of classical considerations. The Mount Cuba Center, I believe it's in Delaware, does a lot of research on how to use native plants using design principles.
Right. Okay.
And by design principles, I mean that within a garden that people would sort of say is beautiful, there are certain things like repetition, like color, like structure, that make your eye look at that garden and say, wow, this is a place I'd like to walk by and see. And you can do that by take your goldenrod, which can be kind of tall and floppy, and you can make a swath of that. And you can have a lawn, reduce it, make a little formal path with a curvilinear sign, take that shape and reflect it in how you move your plants. So you can take keystone plants and put them in this formal structure to make something that's beautiful to your eye and to the public eye. You can use pots and formal things within your garden. You can use real sculptures and artwork. Like, there's so many ways that you can take something that is supporting biodiversity. And when I say biodiversity, I mean native biodiversity, but also conforming to some of the more traditional design ideas. I love wild. It doesn't have to have that, because I can find beauty in the most tiny minutia, but for a lot of people, they need that big picture to flow. And there are some wonderful designers, Wild Ones. Again, it's another United States organization. They have not necessarily commissioned, but they've asked designers to create free designs, and they've posted them now on their website. So if you go to Wild Ones, and you can look around the country to see these formal designs using native plant material, and you can see the results. And I think it can give people this idea that going native doesn't mean just creating what looks to be a weedy space.
Right.
So, I am all for these people who want their gardens to just, I think the flat lawn is out. It's passé. We need to get rid of that concept as being sort of culturally desirable. But we need to understand that people sometimes want areas to walk on, to lie on. And so you need different things within a garden, and different things over different periods in your life. When I was younger and had children and dogs, I needed my space to look very differently than now. I'm a senior, and my grandchild visits occasionally, but I find quite happy to live amongst the wildness.
Right.
And
because I feel like the lawn for me, like the dog, right? The just having an area where he can run around is.
Well, you'll find that actually dogs don't need lawns to run around, and they're perfectly happy running through brush. In fact,
I'm sure he would love that. Yeah.
But it does. There are uses and arguments for it, but if we could just reduce it by half.
Yeah.
and or have a pathway or something of that nature. So that, again, I understand that, this is not something that can happen overnight. There are a few people, I think he's just an amazing individual, took his Burlington, Ontario, took his yard, which was the traditional lawn, and literally, and works, he's in an IT guy, but took his whole property and has transformed it into this, I would say it's just an amazing oasis where, Keystone plants, and it transformed his life. In fact, he basically went from this to saying, I really want to work in the nursery industry.
Wow.
And be part of this transformation, because he saw the change within this little landscape.
Right.
To see all this life started coming, and he started documenting the creatures and the change in creatures that occurred. Now, where in Oakville, where I was, the pest people come and spray the houses every year for spiders. There are people who are very afraid of wildlife. So we have work to do to get people to want to live with other organisms. I'm not an advocate for things that do harm. I, have to kill the mice that come in the house, or trap them and put them outside. I have to, deal with ants and that sort of things inside the structure. But outside, we need to be much more tolerant of life that we share the planet with. To me, it's all about understanding our responsibility as caretakers rather than transformers.
Right. I think that's really well said. So I guess I'd like to go into some resources that are available, but before that, I wonder if you could speak to like outdoor lighting a little bit, because that's something I've seen more popular, and it's something that I really enjoy. But what are the?
I would say it's an absolute no-no.
Right.
It's incredibly harmful for a lot of reasons, and let me explain why. So if you have outdoor lighting, there's good reasons to have it. When you're out there enjoying your space for safety, for beauty, sure, have lights on, but they need to turn off at night. So a lot of lights, because of ecological reasons, people have put them on solar lights, and they stay on all night.
Right.
So what the new research is showing us is that light impacts circadian rhythms, not just of humans, but also of insects. Light at night impacts plants. Plants have a light cycle and a dark cycle. We're keeping artificial light on all night long. The studies that are showing, for instance, with moths, we're causing a decline in their populations because of artificial lights.
Right.
What they're finding is if you have the lights, you're having decline in moths. What people don't understand is that moths are very important pollinators. And there's a really weird and not well understood connection that if moths do not do the pollination at night, it changes the amount of nectar and available for pollinators during the daytime.
Wow.
They're actually interlinked. Really interesting research papers on that. So it's really important for us to protect the moths, keep their functioning. Fireflies, again, artificial lights mess up their reproductive cycles. And again, some of those populations are dwindling and blinking out. We know for humans, artificial lights increase cancer. It impacts our circadian rhythm. We aren't resting well enough. So there, in many ways, it's not even good for us as humans.
Right.
And again, you can study health impacts of artificial light, and you'll see that there's now this huge growing body of literature that's saying we really got to look at this and reduce our own exposures to lights in the evening. Sure, the moon and the stars come out, right? Lights fluctuate over time, but as a whole, if you look at our light profile on this planet, we've just made everything blaze up. And now we're doing it in our gardens, and we're doing it when we don't need it. So sure, have lights
Mm-hmm.
but make sure they can go off at night.
Right, like a scheduling. Yeah, because I do have a couple of the brighter ones, but they're only on for I think 2.5 hours, and then they go off.
Yeah.
But I do have
So,
some solar ones too that I might have to.
no, I did all the solar lights, like my whole garden. It was lit up beautiful.
Yeah.
I'd look out the window and I'd say, "Oh, isn't that nice?" And some people use lights for security, but have the lights that have motion sensors that come on and go
I see.
off.
Okay.
Don't leave them on all the time.
Right.
And again, for the pretty lights in the gardens, figure out how to turn them off so that the creatures in the gardens and your plants can have downtime.
Right.
Again, it's not enough light for them to photosynthesize, and there's not enough research there. But just think about it. I mean, these have a dark cycle and a light cycle. If we don't turn off those lights, we might be impacting it. And again, it's very complex, the different frequencies of light, the red, the blue, the green, all impact different kinds of growth patterns, can impact how plants respond to diseases and that sort of thing. It's very complex. And for the people who grow within greenhouses, there's a lot of cool research on, what frequencies of light do what when for different, and it's different for different species. That's what's really neat. Some plants are photosensitive and others not so much. So, if you look at fall color and you wonder when leaves are turning, some of them are turned on and off by photocycles.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
and
that.
And some of them, it's more temperature related things. So again, evolution, there's a lot of different pathways, very complex, but light matters.
Right. Okay. That's fascinating. Yeah. No, that's good to know. So I wanted to touch on that. So if people are listening to this and they're like, yeah, I want to move towards learning more about this, I'll definitely post some of your talks because I've listened to some of those and they're really informative, and you've shared so much with us today. So I'm just kind of wondering, resource wise, where can people go to find more information about invasive species and all of that?
Well, again, if they want to read more about what my current personal passion, they can visit the CIPR.ca. That's CCIPR.ca. That's the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation. And I didn't talk a lot about that today, mostly because my whole life is sort of revolved around.
Right.
Sometimes I need a break from that.
Yeah.
But we talked about Doug Tallamy's work, and I don't know, do you have associated, I can send you essentially a resource page that you can share with people. And it will link to things that we talked about, like the National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones and some of the researchers in the field. So, lists of keystone plants and that sort of thing.
Perfect. That'd be great.
So I think that might be the most helpful thing to do. And they can, as I said, I'm not, I'm an administrator for the McGroy Facebook page, but don't have time to actively answer people's questions. But it's a good group that's there now. I'm very happy with the moderators, and you can find a lot of resources there.
Yeah, I love following that page, and yeah, I'm going to follow more of your work. So it'll probably end up in the YouTube description, but anything I post on Facebook, I'll try and link that as well. And I really appreciate that. Maybe we can have you on again to talk about the coalition one day when things.
I would love to. Again, it's a bit of a drier talk, and I probably would need to share slides just because of to talk about some of the law. I think people would need some visuals to go with that. Yeah,
for sure. No, we'll definitely.
Otherwise, they'll just glaze over.
Yeah, no, for sure. We'll definitely try and do that. But yeah, so as we kind of wrap up here, what are you working on now? What are you working towards, and what's kind of coming up for you?
I just met day before yesterday with the director of the Food and Drug, the CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency for Plant Regulation. We are trying to change the laws in Canada and trying to get a national database created that will allow people to search for invasive plants, or when they go to a garden center, so they know if something can do harm. I think it's critically missing, and so we made a little bit of headway there. We are working on essentially petitions. The mayor of Oakville has met with him the week before. He's going to put before council a resolution to essentially ask for changes and support for municipalities, because honestly, the invasive plant problem is falling on taxpayers and municipalities to address, and
Right.
they need greater support. So again, most of my work these days is trying to solve the problem of invasive plants spreading in Ontario and across Canada. And it's an uphill struggle, but I see that we're making headway, and at least the conversations are changing, and people are recognizing our responsibility to make changes.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Cathy. You just shared so much wisdom and so much passion for this. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and I really appreciate your work and all that you're doing to try and change us for the better. So I really appreciate your time and sharing this information with us.
You're most welcome. And again, I'm just one little grandma, and I think that if I can do this, many people can, and it's just getting people to speak up and call for change, and together we can make the life better for next generations. That's really what it's about. It's looking to the future and trying to make sure that the planet stays healthy.
Right. And you mentioned your grandchild is one of the reason, or grandchildren are one of the reason that you do this.
Yeah, for sure. But also that little handful of soil.
Right. That was such a beautiful moment. Yeah, to be able to share that. So no, I appreciate all the stories and all the information that you shared, and sitting down with me and having this chat. So great. Thank you so much for this.
Well, you have a wonderful Saturday, and I hope your listeners have a great day, and we can do something positive together.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'll send you the information once it's posted and everything. So again, thank you so much, Cathy Kavassalis. And if someone wants to reach out to you, they can email you or find you on...
Email me, yep. Just my name at gmail.com, or via, social media. Or via the Coalition for Canadian Plant Regulation. I'm pretty easily accessible, though not always fast.
Right. Well, I appreciate you were very responsive to me, and the Master Gardeners page is awesome on Facebook, so I encourage anyone to join that and follow your work. So thank you again, Cathy, so much, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, Nick. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cathy. Bye.